In the national accounts, every quarter, there is the level of GDP and the level of GDP per capita. And from that, through some rather basic maths, you can determine the implied population. And what I've done here is this is a 6 month rolling level of population growth since the borders reopened. What this shows is that population growth peaked late in 2023 and has declined until the end of 2024, which is similar to what you see in the net overseas migration data. You saw it moderate and fall into the end of 2024. But what we've seen in the first 2 quarters of this year in the national accounts is population growth has once again re-accelerated, which is also what we've seen in the net long-term and permanent arrivals data. Now, it's here that some qualifiers need to be added. This is prone to revisions, so it's prone to be changed and revised at a later date. But if we purely take it at face value, we are seeing population growth re-accelerate. Now, this has also been reflected in vacancy rates, both in the CoreLogic and SQM data. It's also been reflected in a rise on a seasonally adjusted basis in rents. So I think there's a fairly robust argument to be made that population growth is once again re-accelerating. And I will add, I don't think that this is from a magical baby boom that's just all of a sudden Australians are having significantly more children, which leaves one other rather obvious driver.
Oh, you mean a few more people might be coming into the country? And yeah, well, that might be a bit of a surprise. Now, of course, the government argues that, well, that boom that we saw earlier on was just a catch up from, because during COVID, nobody came in. So, of course, you allowed more people to come in post COVID to catch up. But if you actually do a bit of a sort of an extension of the long term trends, well, the catch up happened very, very quickly, and it's still well above where it would be just to catch up. So there is clear strategic intent here to actually keep migration strong. Now, I did a show the other day highlighting the fact that if you go and look at some of the UN documentation, there was a report I think published in the year 2000 talking about the fact that migration was going to be a very critical element to maintain the state of economies around the world, particularly Western economies, because the birth rate is so low and dropping. The birth rate in Australia is much lower than it used to be. The birth rate in some other countries like Korea is through the floor. So they were almost arguing that migration was effectively part of the secret sauce of how to keep an economy going. That was written as early as the year 2000 and then revised in 2020. So that there's an interesting sort of thought process there that migration good because it actually helps to keep the economy on kilter, particularly with low birth rates. But then when you actually think about it in more detail, only, and this is what the report actually said, only if you plan for the significant investment in infrastructure that's going to be required in parallel to be able to make it work. And that's the bit that nobody seems to be actually, factoring in. And we discussed it a little bit earlier in the show here. You can flood the economy with more people, but if you don't actually plan for it, and if you don't actually then take account of the fact, as you said, that people need schools and houses and hospitals immediately, then you end up with this national crisis, which is what we have at the moment. So there is a real question about this. And then, of course, the what happened last weekend with the people turning out on the streets and then being branded, neo-Nazis or whatever. There's something more going on than just a few people saying we don't like the current government. There is a bigger question that many people have about this story about migration and the implication for ordinary Australians off the back of it. And that, again, has been downplayed by the government, and I think that's a bit foolish of them.
It's rather ironic because the other day, there's been a backlash, against high levels of migration across much of the world. I mean, this is something that we talked about. I think it was either last show or the one before, and when polling in the EU showed that a majority of people thought migration was too high in every single nation across the European Union. But recently, there's been a backlash against migration in Japan, where migration is, for, relatively speaking, quite low. But this has prompted the Japanese government to turn around and just completely revamp its approach to migration. They got together a bunch of experts in a very genuine way, and they've said, okay, what do we need to do differently in order to make migration into Japan viable? And even so, the level of migration that they're talking is a fraction of what we're talking about, generally speaking, in the West. So they're just like, well, we need to prepare the infrastructure. We need to prepare services. What's the impact on the budget going to be like? What's the budget? What's the going to be the impact on the fabric of our society? What's going to be the impact on crime, on law and order, on changed values, on all these different things? And not only that, but that they've had the foresight to think maybe the people are not going to be too pleased with this. So maybe we should put a relief valve in where we can cut migration if issues, whether they be infrastructure related, whether they be social cohesion related, where by which the government can pull the emergency stop and migration can be cut. And that's an established policy setting within their platform. And I'm just sitting here in Australia thinking the current number of migrants in Japan is less than 3% of the population. Here in Australia, it's in excess of 30% of the population. And here they are preparing for this thing, preparing, for a level of migration that's going to be a fraction of what Australia is going to experience. Yet we're here, and the government has admitted that we can't build enough houses, but we just press on anyway.
Yep. Well, need a bigger GDP. Simple.
Well, someone's got to, prop up these housing prices too. I mean, it's funny. People say, oh, well, migrants don't buy houses. Well, most of them don't. No, they don't. About 5% buy in the first year. Another 10% buy, and probably by the 18 to 24 month mark. But still, 5% of, say, if we do see a surge in back up in migration of 400,000 people, is 20,000 people. And then you can double that for the next year. That's 40,000. That's a lot of homes that people need to buy. And not only that, but then the rest of the migrants that do arrive will then purchase houses at a later date with lagged demand. So, for example, the migrants who arrived prior to the pandemic, then most of them will now be moving towards that time where the median migrant is about to buy a house, which is adding to demand right here, right now. So I think it's very much an overlooked issue on terms, because it's all well and good to just say, well, they don't have the cash in them now. Well, no. But there's also the factor of okay, the government has made this choice regarding migration, but on the other side of the coin, are they pulling back on the other types of demand into housing? Are they, for example, curtailing credit to property investors to ensure that the people who need houses are not competing with too many investors to get them, and then that's pushing up prices? No, they're not doing that either. They're actually increasing the amount of demand from first home buyers with government intervention, so we can pump up housing prices even higher. And it's a mess, really.
And just to round out the discussion on the migrants, the other point, of course, a lot of migrants, when they come, go into the rental sector first. So that's one of the reasons why rentals are actually still growing. Cost of rent still growing quite fast. In fact, they're accelerating again now. And interestingly, in my surveys, if I look at rental stress, so that's the question of people trying to balance their income versus their expenditure. Well, guess what? The first generation Australians, those migrants coming into the country, actually have the highest rental stress of all of my cohorts. And that's something which is worth just thinking about. So people are coming to Australia and then effectively finding that they're almost immediately in financial pressure, sometimes because they're actually earning less on average, and also because their costs tend to be quite high because they're paying high rent as well. So again, this is putting greater pressure on the rental sector, which in turn makes it harder and harder for ordinary Australians to be able to get on the rental ladder themselves. So, however you look at it, we are digging this deeper and deeper hole, or going back to the sink analogy, we're going round and round the plug hole.
Yeah, and I think the thing that gets me is, and forgive me if this turns into a rant, viewers, but we're given these stories of, won't someone please think about the migrants, think about what they're facing, their issues. Okay, let's do it. Let's think about the migrants. As you say, they're being put into a rental sector, generally speaking, overwhelmingly put into a rental sector where finding a rental is still very, very difficult. There is still the rental crisis. And as your data shows, people, they are in the most severe levels of rental stress. Okay, well, now let's look at the labour market that welcomes them. For people aged 18 to 30, and most of the migrants coming to Australia are, generally speaking, in that demographic, 33%, one in three people in that age demographic is exploited. One in three is underpaid by at least 40% below the minimum wage, right? So we've got migrants coming in to challenging housing conditions, challenging employment conditions, where we're just off some rough math, you've got about 1 million people, maybe more, being exploited and underpaid, right? So, okay, so people say, let's think about the migrants. Well, let's do that. Let's think about the migrants and let's think about the impact that all that's having on not only on the migrants, but on the existing population. It's an absolute bloody mess. But is it going to be fixed? Is anyone even trying to fix it in a meaningful way? Not that I can see.
Actually, nobody even wants to really talk about it. And that's, as soon as you start raising these sorts of issues, then you're basically accused of being anti-migration or worse, or, bucketed in with the small proportion of those people at the weekend, the protesters who are actually driving other agendas and other issues. And so they try to cover it up and say, oh, no, 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 that's not how you should think about it. You should think about it this way. We've always been a country that accepts high numbers of people coming into the country. We've always done this, we've always done that. But then you go back and look at the 50s and the 60s and look at the social programs and the economic programs that were there to support the high levels of migration into Australia, building houses and everything else. And you compare that with what we've got now. We've still got the numbers of people coming in, but there is no means of visible or invisible support. And no surprise that, of course, the people who are in the country are saying, well, hang on a moment, this doesn't seem very fair because it's harder and harder for me as a young person in Australia trying to form a family or buy a home or get somewhere to rent. I'm just competing more and more with a whole bunch of other people. And that's why you start seeing this social fragmentation. And, the latest crime stats in Victoria are a bit of an object lesson in what happens when this all goes wrong.
I think the problem is that a lot of the narratives surrounding migration basically rest on, if I'm going to be charitable, I'm going to call them myths. If I'm not going to be charitable, I'd call them something else, but that's for another day. Because the issue is, say, for example, the idea is migrants build houses. Now, back in the day, they did. Absolutely, they built houses. They built infrastructure. There were times in the late 1940s and early 1950s where some academic estimates put the number of tradesmen at roughly 1 in 4 migrants. So, you could very quickly, with that number of people, build a whole heap of houses, and that's exactly what we did. Like people, like my dad. He got here, on just before the end of the week, and on Monday he started working on building a new hospital in Melbourne. And that's the way it worked back in the day. But in this day and age, it's not like that anymore. Migrants are significantly less likely to work at the coalface in a trade than the average Australian. Although I will note that there is actually a group of migrant that is more likely to work in a trade. Now you'd think, well, that'd be skilled migrants, right? No, no. Skilled migrants are significantly less likely to work in a trade. It's refugees. Refugees are significantly more likely than migrants to work in a trade, and they're significantly more likely than the rest of the population to work in a trade. So if you look at that, I just think that's rather ironic that the people who are chosen for their status, as a refugee for a humanitarian reason, are the ones who are actually more likely to provide the labor on the work sites to build our homes and to build our infrastructure than those actually chosen for their skills. And I just think that just absolutely blows to bits any ideas of this, this idea that migration is positive for home building, because it's not. It's a net negative for home building. It shouldn't be, but that's just unfortunately the way it is.